Unions, when I think about unions, I think of things brought in during the Industrial Revolution to protect coal workers from working 18 hours a day, to bring in basic safety standards, maybe to stop 8-year-olds from working in factories. I think the idea of unions today, as they're commonly known, that is, people who work for the government in an office, I think it would make people giggle 150 years ago. What, you work in an office for the government?
It's very common for people to say that, unions used to have a purpose, but now it's not the 19th century. We've come a long way since unions were fighting for child labor laws and for minimum wages and, basic health and safety in the workplace. And so now that we have all that legislation, what do we really need unions for anymore? But I think we really have to put this into some larger historical perspective that unions were not only fundamental in creating that legislation, but they continue to be really important in responding to changing social and economic conditions. One reason why workers continue to need unions is that they need some form of collective representation to deal with the problems that they confront as they evolve in the changing workplace and the changing economy. The other reason that workers really need unions is that all of these forms of legislation, whether it's employment standards or health and safety legislation, none of those are guaranteed or eternal, right? All of those forms of rights can be rolled back. And in that sense, unions are one of the key mechanisms that workers have to not only make sure that those laws are actually implemented in workplaces, but are protected from future attempts to roll those gains back. If we talk about employment standards, right? Employment Standards Acts, they establish the minimum level of rights in any workplace, whether people are unionized or not. And so it is the legal minimum. So unions fought to have those legal minimums established, right? They were at the forefront of fighting for, limitations on the length of the working day and of the working week. They fought for a minimum wage that would, prevent people from basically being sweated labor, right? Historically, they were at the forefront of creating those rights for all workers. But they're also really central in making sure that they get implemented. What many workers' advocates have shown is that there is a major enforcement gap in employment standards in non-unionized workplaces. So even while the laws exist, they have to be enforced for them to mean something. What we see is that in non-unionized workplaces, people often are not paid the minimum wage. They're paid less than the minimum wage, or they're not paid statutory holiday pay, or they are pressured to work beyond the legally mandated work week and not get paid overtime. And sometimes they're not even paid at all.
They've been left to fend for themselves. Now former IQT employees are fending for each other with a little help from the community. The 450 Laval employees were told last week they were out of work and out their last 2 weeks' pay.
I feel like we were like a money machine, like they used us to make as much money as they could, and then they disappeared, and then we get nothing.
So workers' advocates who've actually done a great deal of research around employment standards enforcement show that actually employers violate employment standards all the time. So where do unions come in? Well, it's very difficult for individual workers to enforce their legal rights under Employment Standards Acts. They have to educate themselves about what their rights are. They have to inform themselves about what the process is to file a complaint, follow it all the way to the end. And even though there are legal protections against reprisals, that doesn't mean that employers won't engage in reprisals against workers who complain. And so when workers are there on their own with no form of collective protection like a union provides, they're much less likely to have their legal rights enforced and be made meaningful to them. So, that's just one example of how having a law on the books doesn't actually mean that it's enforced and made meaningful for people in reality. And a union has a really important role to play in making sure that not only are those standards enforced, but that people actually are gaining, a livelihood above the basic minimum.